Whoever you are, however much you think you know about the August 1929 uprising around the Western Wall in Palestine, I guarantee you will learn something in this post. This is Start Here 14, going through my Palestine timeline supplement, and today we'll be discussing the 1929 Western Wall Uprising. At this point in the story of Palestine, we are really going to start seeing atrocities, and that is going to be very upsetting for many people watching this, regardless of where their sympathies lie. And August 1929 is the first major outbreak of violence in Palestine in the anti-colonial struggle of the indigenous people. If you were to look at any standard Zionist media outlet telling the story of 1929 in Palestine, it tends to follow a very straightforward narrative of anti-Semitic Palestinians, in particular the villainous Grand Mufti, who incited a bunch of poor, dumb, uneducated peasant farmers to do violence against Jewish people because the Grand Mufti didn't want to share the Western Wall. If that's the narrative you believe, welcome. I am here to debunk some of the information and to provide context for the rest of that highly propagandized narrative. Because remember, the best propaganda, almost all of it, is based off of true events. So we need to resist the urge to react emotionally, which is the purpose of propaganda, and instead react critically by putting those events into a context that makes more sense. In this case, like every other event we have described in this series so far, that context is the anti-colonial struggle of the indigenous Palestinians. 1929 is often somewhat grandiosely referred to by historians as something like year zero or the point of no return. But we're actually going to start a little bit earlier in September 1928 on the eve of Yom Kippur in Jerusalem with something called the Screen Incident. That evening, an Ashkenazi man brings several Jewish implements of worship, ostensibly in preparation for the holiday on the following day, which includes a larger ark than usual, some mats and lamps, and attaches a mechitza, or gender screen, blocking the entire street. Nowadays, the Western Wall is a big plaza, but back then it was a very narrow street, about 11 feet wide. And people lived there, so this was blocking their path home. With like donkeys and mules, they couldn't get home, and so it was immediately reported to the British authorities and Palestine police. You see, there was a precedent that had existed in the late Ottoman Empire that prevented Jewish people from setting up any sort of permanent structures or temporary furniture at the Western Wall. And the reason for that was the Muslim fear of expropriation, which basically means that if they were able to set up enough permanent structures that were related to Judaism, then they could legally claim it as an open-air synagogue, thus giving them jurisdiction over that area of Jerusalem. This was a real thing. However likely it was one way or the other, it was certainly more likely to be held up under British rule, and the Muslims were very wary of it. The Ashkenazi man was immediately ordered to take the implements down, and in particular take down the screen to stop blocking the street. But by the following morning, that had not been done. The police were called to order them again to take the screen down, but now the Jewish worshippers who had gathered said it's a day of rest and that counts as work. An altercation ensued. The police forcibly removed the screen, and according to one report, the most violent thing that happened during the clash was an irate elderly Jewish woman who repeatedly beat a policeman with her umbrella. And that was the end of it. However, the complaints from all related parties afterwards greatly exaggerated the event. Some Arab Palestinian authorities complained that it was an outright attempt to take over the wall, while Zionist Jewish authorities compared it to being at least as bad, if not worse, than pogroms in Russia. While there had been other attempts by Zionists to install all sorts of furniture and dividers and screens and whatnot at the Western Wall, this particular event incited quite a lot of buzz. And by October, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who is the villain in most Zionist narratives, started organizing various protests and provocations toward Jewish people praying at the wall. And tensions continued to grow over the next 6 months or so. Another big part of the Zionist narrative surrounding the Western Wall Uprising is that in August, the Grand Mufti lied to the uneducated Arabs, telling them that the Jews wished to take over the Western Wall. Whether or not this was true, certainly David Ben-Gurion had stated it, as well as Jabotinsky had very expressly stated it, in some cases suggesting timelines of Jewish control of the Western Wall in as soon as 6 months to a year. In addition to that, quite often, fundraisers for Zionism included images of things like the Western Wall, the Dome of the Rock, and other Islamic structures on the Temple Mount and in Jerusalem covered in Jewish symbols or with the flag or the Star of David over them. And there was more than just that. That's just a small example of the very clearly stated intentions by most Zionists, certainly the far-right extremist Zionists. These images and very clearly stated intents from at least some factions of Zionists are what actually helped incite the Falahin, the peasant farmers, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the Muslims in Palestine to eventually break out into violence. But we're not even there yet, because there's more. The Pro-Wailing Wall Committee, the Wailing Wall being the Western Wall, was established by far-right Zionist Joseph Klausner, who was professor of Hebrew literature, who promoted Jewish access to the Western Wall and control over it and establishing a synagogue and so forth. These were greatly supported by various Zionist youth groups, including Jabotinsky's Beitar, who were openly pro-fascist, modeled after fascist youth groups, militant, believed in greater Israel, Jewish supremacy, eugenics, Ashkenazi supremacy over the old Yeshuv in Palestine. Just exactly what you would imagine a fascist youth group to look like, but Zionist. By spring, Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionists and Ben-Gurion had made outright calls for what they called either a rebuilding of the temple or that the wall should be redeemed, meaning that Arab and Muslim presence at the wall was defiling it. And Jabotinsky published in a newspaper a long-running campaign claiming Jewish rights over the wall and its pavement, calling outright for insubordination and violence, pleading that Jews not stop protesting and demonstrating until the wall is restored to us, quote unquote. On August 14th, 1929, the Pro-Wailing Wall Committee, along with Haganah and other factions, organized several demonstrations involving at least 6,000 Zionist youth marching around the old city of Jerusalem, flying the Zionist flag, and singing Hatikvah. And on the 15th, some portion of those same right-wing extremist youths came back and marched straight to the Western Wall, bearing staves, and shouted, "The wall is ours, the wall is ours." And on August 16th, due to a completely unrelated altercation, a Sephardic Jewish teenager, 17 years old, named Abraham Mizrahi, is stabbed in just some other argument in Jerusalem. A policeman shows up after the stabbing who happens to be Arab, so a Jewish mob attacks the policeman. Then, a mob of dozens of Jews attacks and burns shacks erected near the Bukhara neighborhood, assaulted the family of one of the Arabs there, and attacked Ali Abdullah Hassan. Hassan had shut himself up in his house, but the mob broke into his house and stabbed him repeatedly. And Hassan's Jewish neighbor, a grocer named Shimon, tried to protect him, and the Jewish mob beat Shimon too, which is the first of several indications that this story is not just a simple narrative of anti-Semitic Arab versus Jew. By now, tensions have really started to skyrocket. There are no fatalities, but things like stone throwing and beatings happens from both sides. By August 19th, Arabs and Jews have started to arm themselves, mostly with stones, staves, knives, daggers. But on August 20th, the Jewish man who was stabbed on the 16th, Abraham Mizrahi, dies of his wounds. On the following day, August 21st, his funeral breaks out into more clashes, which is quickly broken up by British authorities. However, at this point, everybody is starting to expect a larger outbreak of violence in the coming days. On August 22nd, tensions mount and armed groups in all locations are patrolling, ready for a fight. On the morning of August 23rd, thousands of Arab Falahin enter Jerusalem from the surrounding countryside to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, many armed with sticks and knives. By 9:30 a.m., expecting violence, most Jewish storekeepers in Jerusalem had begun closing their shops. Somewhere around 11 a.m., 20 to 30 gunshots are heard in the direction of the Temple Mount. Most agree these were either fired into the air as part of incitement of a crowd or possibly warning shots by authorities. The first reported deaths of August 23rd are 2, possibly 3 Arabs killed in the Jewish neighborhood of Mea She'arim, which is related to where the violence had happened a few days previously. According to the Shaw Commission, at this point, it is unclear whether Arab crowds were aware of the deaths or not, but after that point, it was certainly clear, at least in the eyes of the British authorities, that the Arab crowds meant to do something. Somewhere around 1:15 p.m., violence breaks out as the Arab crowds begin attacking Jews in the Old City of Jerusalem. Throughout the rest of August 23rd, violence quickly spreads across the entirety of Palestine, overwhelming British authorities and police who were entirely unprepared for the scale of the uprising. In addition to the Palestine police, which was composed of British and a few Jewish members but was mostly Arab, the British themselves had fewer than 100 soldiers in Palestine, about 6 armored cars, and 5 or 6 aircraft in the entire country. On August 24th, one of the largest, most horrific massacres up till this point in Palestine takes place in Hebron. The Arab mobs attack the Jewish community, killing between 65 and 68 and wounding at least 50. The remainder of the Jews who were unharmed are taken in by other Palestinian Arabs into their homes to protect them from the mobs raging through the streets. Over the next several days, so from August 25th to 29th, violence continues to break out all over Palestine. More Arab mobs massacre Jews in smaller number, but just as horrifically, in places like Safed, Tel Aviv, and a few other Jewish settlements and kibbutzes. And a few retaliation massacres occur, Jews against Arabs, particularly in Jaffa, and some mosques, for example, the one in Jerusalem called Nebi Akasha. By the 29th, British reinforcements finally arrive, but are unable to immediately quell the fighting. But by the next day, August 30th, the British authorities finally gain the upper hand through the use of pretty extreme force. This includes battleships arriving, carrying hordes of British troops, which are deployed to key areas to significantly bolster the existing police and military presence and help them gain the upper hand against the uprising. Casualty reports that we know of are during the week of rioting from the 23rd to the 30th, 133 Jews were killed by Arabs and 339 injured. 116 Arabs killed and at least 232 wounded. This was mostly done by the Mandate police. However, it is notable that the British authorities accepted the Jewish reports of casualties. However, they only accepted reports from hospitals and medical centers for Arab casualties, so it's generally assumed that the Arab number of wounded and how they died is underrepresented. Repercussions also overwhelmingly targeted Arabs. While 40% of the Arabs were convicted, only 3% of Jewish people were convicted. This is generally seen as just the general favoritism towards Zionism by the British authorities and also as a result of bribes. Taken aback by the ferocity of the uprising in Palestine, the British commissioned the Shaw Report to investigate what had happened. The Shaw Commission, while generally considered to be fairly favorable towards the Jewish and Zionist narrative in Palestine, still concludes that while the inciting incident was the gathering on August the 15th and the chanting of "the wall is ours" at the Western Wall, the underlying problems were of the fear of economic insecurity and the lack of representation in the political goings-on in Mandate Palestine. The fundamental cause of the violence, quote, "without which, in our opinion, disturbances either would not have occurred or would have been little more than a local riot, is the Arab feeling of animosity and hostility towards the Jews consequent upon the disappointment of their political and national aspirations and fear for their economic future." It also mentions the Arab fears of Jewish immigrants not only as a menace to their livelihood, but a possible overlord of the future. It also found that the Mufti was not particularly at fault for the uprising, and in fact gave an attempt at a pacifying speech which only seemed to enrage the Arab mobs more. Several months after August, celebrated historian Hans Kohn, who was active in the Zionist movement from 1909 onwards, wrote the following letter. "I feel that I can no longer remain a leading official within the Zionist organization. We pretend to be innocent victims. Of course the Arabs attacked us in August. Since they have no armies, they could not obey the rules of war. They perpetrated all the barbaric acts that are characteristic of a colonial revolt. But we are obliged to look into the deeper cause of this revolt. We have been in Palestine for 12 years without having even once made a serious attempt at seeking through negotiations the consent of the indigenous people. We have been relying exclusively on Great Britain's military might. We have set ourselves goals which by their very nature had to lead to conflict with the Arabs. For 12 years we pretended that the Arabs did not exist and were glad when we were not reminded of their existence." I'm Paul Nabil, and that was Start Here 15. Next up, the Nazis.